Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Thank you very much, everybody. Welcome to the Sunday afternoon Cash American Knowledge Team meeting. And it's a very important meeting because it follows in the jet stream of the Knowledge Seekers workshops every Thursday and the Brazilian Knowledge Seekers workshops every Friday. And we have so many people from around the world who are supporting us in this. So if I may continue at this point, and let's see how we do here. And this is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science. We're in the advanced inertia stage, and based on all the questions, it's become very important to understand this even more. As we're today discussing momentum, for me personally, this was a very difficult thing to understand. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada, and it's March the 30th of 2025. And this is part of the Keshe Foundation North America Plasma Education Series.
Your screen hasn't changed, Alex.
I'm sorry?
On disclaimer. You're still on. That's what I'm seeing.
There it is.
That's got it.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, then. So, but you're hearing me okay, I hope.
Loud and clear.
Okay. So we are trying to distill all the knowledge from the thousands of hours of teaching, and many of us are working very diligently to condense a lot of things. But we do have new people that are coming. As our estimates, we are only referencing maybe 5 to 7% of the world's population. So we have a huge mountain to climb, and we will. But it takes more than just a few teachers that we have at this point in time, and it also begs the question: what do you teach? So we do have an entrenched knowledge in terms of our physicality, and so we're trying to get out of that trench. And last week we discussed chakra levels, and today we're going to discuss momentum because it's a very difficult thing to understand based on the explanations that we've been given. So it keeps us on the hesitancy highway because it's the lowest energy state. And we always reference to that because, we've always looked at our freedom as being westward bound. And so all the wagon trains, as we know from our immediate history in North America, has been westward ho. And of course, there are a lot of perils, and we don't want to let the tumbleweeds slow us down. They do have a tendency to break our cartwheels. And, as we're continually searching for outer space and trying to relate to our history, we see that there's something about our little piece of pie in the sky. And, maybe it's the apple of mother's eye, or maybe it's just a cartwheel that's gaining momentum on the plasma highway to our little pie in the sky. But either way, it's still a little pie and it's still somewhere in the sky, and we don't really understand a lot of things. And this is our goal. And so we have to incorporate the plasma knowledge. And so initially in the books of Marin Tabakoli-Kesh, like in book number 1, we discussed the universal order of the creation of matter, which is the bringing together of 3 energy states: the matter state, dark matter state, and the antimatter state. And when we wonder where that come from, well, fortunately, there was book number 2, and it talked about the structure of the light. And so when we think about light, structure does not come to mind. But when we see the light coming and going, it definitely implies duality. So this is something that momentum plays a big part in. And then something else happens. As we see in book number 3, The Origin of the Universe, the 1 splits up into 2. And in this particular picture, that 1 leads to its demise. And so if that leads to its demise and creates the other 2, how do they sustain themselves? And so that becomes a big question. And mankind has been forever trying to figure out how to sustain himself. And so as we see in the picture here from the One Nation, One Planet, One Race for Justice and World Peace, which Rick Raman and the Universal Council have been trying for 371 weeks to bring it together. Food is important. Well, of course, water is as well. Air, well, that's really important. And it'd be nice to have a nice place to stay. And yet here we are in the year 2025, and we're still discussing essentials. And why is that? And does it have something to do with the fact that not only are we on the hesitancy highway, but that highway is overrun with bandits? So that's why we need commandments. So these are the 10 commandments, and it's assumed that they're for us. So not for dogs or pigeons or for chickens or cows. These are for us. And then we start to get an inkling that something's missing. And there's another 14 commandments missing. And so we see that there's an incompleteness into our learning. And maybe there are other problems with that. So why can't we get on the transmutation highway with our learning? So we see that at the basis is only the carbon 12, which is one of the elements on the periodic table, but there's other. For instance, carbon 14 and carbon 10, and carbon 16 and carbon 6. And we find on each level that they total up to be 24. So somehow, some way, the bottom level, which only has carbon 12, is missing 12. And 12 and 12 is 24, which interestingly enough is the same number of commandments, and they were also missing. So there's a big part of the picture that we're missing. So maybe it's in the background, or maybe we're just not seeing the inertia table and how it's affecting us. We're only seeing half the picture, and we're trying to figure out what that picture really looks like. And in our physicality, fortunately, we have a left side and a right side, so we think we can see the whole picture. But can we see the rest of the person that's hidden behind? Can we see where that person is connected to? Or can we see what the motives are of that person? So how do we determine our consistency? And a lot of people think that the only consistency that we have is in a chaotic, random consistency, where what we're trying to achieve is a practical understanding. And in order to do that, we have to clarify the scientific consistency and the religious consistency. So there are efforts underway to clarify that. And in that process, it becomes kind of obscure, because what we don't see is what is the factor that is at play. And so there's relationships, and this is the key. So fundamentally in the plasma science, the magnetical and gravitational relationship is in a balance, and we call that a mag graph. But is it absolutely equal? Or is it just a relationship that is balanced? So in scientific responsibility, we keep talking about conservation. Magnetic fields versus the energy fields. And in the spiritual scientific community, we talk about the spirit and the soul and that other foo-foo state, the dream state. So somehow the plasma science has to add to the knowledge by bringing together the relationship of these two scientific communities. And there is a rate of change. But what is that rate of change? And is it fast enough? And is it gathering momentum? Many people think so. And how is it gathering momentum? And what is the basis of that? And what does momentum mean? And if you're an athlete and you're playing a team sport and you find that your team is losing, and then an event happens and it changes the emotional context of the match, and you say, oh, the other team has lost their momentum, or maybe your team has gained momentum. And what exactly is that? Can you package it and put it in a bag? Wouldn't that be great? Oh, your team gained all the momentum and won the game. Let's package that, and maybe we could sell it at the chip stand. So we see that creation is part of something, and we don't really understand it. So we rely on vehicles of understanding, vehicles of transportation, vehicles kind of carry our momentum to various places. And so we're called the four-wheelers of creation, which is kind of almost insulting, but we deserve it, because here we are not understanding the relationship between the creation and decay and how it happens to work on one part of the picture, but on the other part that is unseen, we have the same balance. And so the one picture is balanced by the other picture, and that creates an inertia field, which is bound together. And since we can't see it and we can't understand it and we can't explain it, then we have to fudge it. And that becomes our bonding fudge factor. And it all has to do with the relationship with our intensity and our outensity. So this is where we have the problem as we look at our history and as we head west as pioneers. We wonder, are we looking at the reality, or are we just seeing a reflection or an illusion. What exactly are we striving for? We do see the eagles soaring, though. So where are they going? So somehow, some way, there is a plasma inertia junction. And we have to take that into account, where we have one track coming together with another track. And this becomes part of the transition. And in order to facilitate that, we're not specifying if it's up or down. We're just going to hit a medium point where we have this transfer state dimension. Now, in the physicality, in the computer world, in the scientific world, we may call this the NP junction. NP stands for neutral, negative, and P for positive. And the junction takes care of the neutral point, the crossover point. So we have a transition from the negative to the positive, but somehow there has to be a feedback from the positive to the negative. And it has to go through this junction we call the NP junction. Okay, well, that's great. So now we have a junction, but, you know, how do we move on that track? And then how do we get to the other track? And how do we get back? Or do we just fall off the track? So there are a lot of changes. So maybe to help our understanding, we talked a lot about gradients and the charge. So the charge is negative or positive. And so there has to be a junction where the negative and the positive are in balance. And we often refer to this as the polar momentum. So we understand that energy is mass in motion. So when we look at the polar express, we see that it goes from the positive, and let's say in this case, the surface of the sun, and it emanates energy. And of course, the flowing of the energy out is negative. But in order to maintain its containment within that polar momentum, it does have to kind of rotate. So in that rotation, there is still a motion, and that motion is the gradient charge that goes from the positive to the negative. And we all understand that, you know, if we've ever slid down a hill, top of the hill being positive, the bottom being negative, and down you go, and it's a slippery slope. But we all know that we can get back up. But what happens if we have a collision, or we have what we call a perpendicular momentum? And then something curtails our gradient charge in that linear direction. And so it kind of curls it over. So we still have the mass in motion, but now it's impacted from the side. And it changes our relationship. And it creates a rotating field at the outer extremity of the emission. And interestingly enough, we have different layers. And so these layers are also rotating. And so there's a stacking of layers. So we have perpendicular motion, and we have multiple layers. And so we still have this gradient charge. But then it comes to a point where that rotating field maintains its containment by having a gradient momentum where it can actually depart, get separated, because the energy is still going from the positive to negative, and it's still continuing. It doesn't just come down the gradient and then that's it. You sliding down the hill may be sliding alone, but you better keep going, because in the universe, there's a lot of people sliding behind you, and they're going to come crashing into you. So you better keep moving. So this gradient momentum has to keep going. And then at some point in time, as we know, birds leave the nest. And how come that bird leaves the nest? Where's it going? Well, it has to create another nest. And so that nest becomes a containment. And within that containment is another rotating field, and the cycle repeats. And as the bird grows, and as the nest is built, it's gaining momentum. Well, isn't that wonderful? And it does it bit by bit. Maybe the bird nest is made from grass, one blade of grass at a time. And at some point in time, the blade of grass, which is a linear momentum, becomes a rotating field. Call it the nest. So the nest has gained momentum. And is that it? Is that the end? Well, we know it's not, because then the birds lay some eggs and the system grows. So the plasma rule is the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. And so this rotating field of containment, many of us view that as a conflict point. But this containment is actually a binding zone. And it can take on a life of its own and then eventually depart. And this is the point. Because whether it's conflict or whether it's a binding zone, it has to derive its momentum somehow, which means that the energy has to keep coming. And if the energy keeps coming, it means that that coming of energy has a momentum. Okay, so we have a linear momentum, we have a rotating momentum. And how does this all work then? And when we don't understand, or when we're told certain things, we know that that energy is necessary for our binding. So since it's ours, it's self-serving. But do we have to do that at the expense of others? Because their binding is also self-serving. And so this becomes a problem in our humanity civilization, because we have a rotating field. We call it the earth. And on this earth, we have a humanity civilization, which is also a rotating field. And it has many layers. It has many colors. And it has many contagious issues, because each of us is dependent on the life forces that this planet gives. And it needs to be consistent. It needs to be subsistent. We need to have enough air, water, food, and shelter, and space, so that we can extend our humanity civilization. And so we're gaining momentum. But through wars and other subterfuge, we lose that momentum. And so in an athletic sport, it's a lot of fun to watch. It's entertainment. But fighting for this planet is not a matter of entertainment. And is it for our own self-serving needs? So scientifically, there is a principle called the exclusion principle. And it's an interesting name because how do you exclude yourself from the universe? Do you just pop out of there like a cork out of a wine bottle? You can hear the pop. Maybe it pops so hard it hits the ceiling and bounces on the floor behind a Chesterfield or something and it's gone. But Mr. Pauly did not formulate his exclusion principle on the basis of classical theories or dynamic principles, but stated it as a simple postulate that no two electrons in an atom can share the same set of four quantum numbers. Let's call that dimensions. And so according to that principle, an orbital can only hold a maximum of two electrons with opposing spins. Well, doesn't that put a spin on our discussion? And here's another one, the Aufbau principle. This principle states that electrons will occupy lower energy orbitals before moving on to higher energy orbitals. Well, doesn't that make sense? Because when you're starting, right, you're starting at the lowest energy state. So if you want to elevate to go to a higher energy state, you have to gain momentum. Yeah, okay. So now we understand maybe a little bit different our core dependency. So on our magnetical position, we see the electron as being magnetical, but there's also positron. Well, that would work with the exclusion principle. And on the gravitational side, we see the neutron and the proton. Well, that would also kind of work. And on the gravitational, of course, being of the lowest energy. Oh, but is it the lowest energy? And then moving higher, the magnetical, well, is the magnetical the higher energy? Okay, so we're having a little problem here trying to figure out, are we referencing me or are we referencing my shadow? Because we're trying to exclude something from this discussion. And that's what we've been doing all our life. We're only looking at part of the picture. And so we can try these pathways of energy, right? We have athletic tracks. As a track star, maybe you have to run down a lane. Or as a football player, you have to stay within the bylines. Or you run around the track. Well, don't the planets do that? They run around in orbits, but each orbit has its own orbital. And atoms do the same thing. The electrons rotate around the nucleus, and they have their own orbitals. And then, of course, we have our own arenas. And so these are all places that we gather and set up pathways, and they're all kind of contrived because they're man-made. And so we see the stress, the conflict, the heat, the pressure. And so how does that relate to the MAGRAV pathways, which we're talking about force fields of attraction and repulsion? The attraction being gravitational intensity and the repulsion being magnetical outtensity. The attraction is the feedback because the repulsion is the feeding. And that is the difference between the electron and the neutron. So it also depends on your point of view. And of course, there are two views. So can we get this magnetical consistency to understand that not only is there a linear momentum that comes from the source and extends out. So going from the gravitational neutron to the magnetical electron. But also there's a perpendicular force which creates a rotating field. And so the motion from one side to the other side isn't a straight line, but is actually curved. And the reason for it is because there's a consistency of the tensity between the neutron and the electron. So regardless of wherever it is on that orbital, its position remains within the balance of the intensity and the outtensity. And it is that momentum that keeps it within range. So there are ways of moving in that range without releasing from that range. But we do know that if that field has enough energy, has enough rotational capacity, that it will release. And it will maintain its own consistency. Okay, then. Well, so what are we talking about? We're talking about momentum. And this is a gradient momentum. And so if we were to look at this rotating field, momentum has to do with magnitude and direction. And so you can think of like a cartwheel that's turning or a ball and string, where the rotating is going from a higher to a lower. So just like you sliding down a hill, you're going from the higher to the lower. So the gradient momentum is there, and that can be measured. So momentum in physics is a measure of an object's mass in motion, calculated as a product of its mass and velocity. It's a vector quantity, meaning it has both magnitude and direction. And so what is the moment arm? Because this is often referred to as a lever arm. It's the perpendicular distance between a joint, say in the context of exercise, a biomechanical exercise. Let's say you're doing a curl, and a line of force. So your arm is the momentum arm, and it's moving, and it has a force. So if you're doing an arm curl, you're obviously lifting your arm. But if you're going from a higher to a lower, and then you're going the opposite direction. So we have a conservation of momentum. That's right. It states that with some problem domain, the amount of momentum remains constant. It's like the speed of light, it's constant. Momentum is neither created nor destroyed, but only changed through the action of forces as described by Newton's law of motion. Well, I thought my sports team was winning because they gained momentum, and the other team, oh, well, of course. My team's momentum gained at the expense of the other team. So the loss of momentum on the other team plus the gain of momentum on my team remains constant. Well, isn't that interesting? where is the rest of the energy coming from? Because if we're only dealing with conservation of momentum, aren't we kind of excluding ourselves from the rest of the picture? There's something wrong. And this is the problem with the conservation of inertia, because it deals with MAGRAV energy transfer states. And so we've seen that we can have an atomic state, a nanostate, and a GAN state, which are all different energy states. And there is a balance of the magnetical gravitational force on one side and the magnetical gravitational force on the other side. But if we don't specify which side, then somehow, some way, we can change energy states. So is that all attributed to momentum? Or does it have something to do with the matter-gen convergence susceptibility? And then we get angular momentum. And this is a real stumbling block, because it's defined as the property of any rotating object given by the motion of inertia times the angular velocity. And it is a property of the rotating body given by the product of the moment of inertia and the angular velocity of the rotating object. And so the reason they call it angular momentum, of course, is because it is tethered. So if it wasn't tied like a ball and string, it would just keep going. But it doesn't. It doesn't keep going in a straight line. It falls from a higher state to a lower state. It changes the angle. It changes the relationship. And so angular momentum is the rotational analog of linear momentum. Yeah, so there's a limit, right? We hit the outer limit, so we have a perpendicular force which is imparting an angular momentum. And it is an important physical quantity because it is conserved quantity. Oh, here we go. So the total angular momentum of a closed system remains constant. Angular momentum has both a direction and a magnitude, and both are conserved. So by changing the direction, do we change the magnitude? Or are there other factors? And how can you have a closed system? Well, maybe you can exclude yourself from the universe. Just pop that cork. And so we have a conservation of angular momentum. And that equals the moment of inertia plus the angular velocity. So in order to maintain a balance, the relationship of the angular momentum is inversely proportional to the angular velocity. Now, where have we seen that before? Well, in the color of light, isn't it? The wavelength and the frequency is inversely proportional. In all cases, the moment of inertia is conserved. So therefore, by definition, the moment of inertia is a combination of the angular momentum and the angular velocity. The moment of inertia is a byproduct of two fields coming together. And isn't that what we did with the cups of life? We brought the cup 1 and we brought cup 2 together. And within them, we had matter state, nanostate, and we created GAN state. And so the GANs became the product of our setup. And we created many different GANSs. And all of these became a radiance manifestation a byproduct, an inertia product, such as carbon dioxide GANs, calcium GANs, zinc and copper, water, amino acid, and even gold, just to name a few. But from our point of view, what's really important in our track are containment. We have a soul. And that soul adds to the emotion and the physicality. And so each track becomes part of the containment within another track. And so there has been a change of momentum. Sometimes we're excited, and sometimes we're depressed. And sometimes we feel we can conquer the world, and other times we're suicidal. So is the balance between those who are depressed and those who are excited balanced? Does that conserve momentum? Or what about the one-track cup of the universe? If we have the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain, and they come together, do we have the conservation of momentum there? The integration of the two sides, the hemispheric synchronization, the coherence, the coming together, the inertia of our physical presence coming together from the cup of the universe. Our physical presence not only being a maggrav, balance, but also being a conservation of inertia, a product of two fields. So in physics, we think of the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain as the mind being the builder. But that seems to be the only half of the picture, because we know that the Earth was here before we got here. And how did that happen? And so when we look at the grand central junction of the Earth ganses, we see that we can create a gans of every element on the periodic table, and every element on the periodic table constitutes part of the Earth space. And we are also part of that Earth space. So our embodiment of the Earth space range details is contained within our physicality. But when we look at the periodic table of elements, there's a consistency. There are protons and neutrons and electrons, and there are mass. And then there is a gradient charge based on density, based on mass. Where did we get the momentum from? Oh, that's right. The Earth is rotating. Oh, yes, that's right. Yes, the Earth is also rotating around the sun. So there are two rotations, one around the sun and one around the axis. So in the beginning, we had the neutron, and that came before the atom and the PM tick. And when we look out into what we call outer space, which is not really, it's just our inner space, we come from the darkness. We say, let there be light. Okay. So what we see in terms of light is only half the picture. What we don't see is where it came from. But it came from in the beginning. And it came as a PM tick. But many PM ticks came, and they were all magnetic, and they all converged together and created the antimatter, dark matter, and the matter, and they all converged together in a maggrav form. But it could not manifest in its physicality until it had a place to go to. And so our Earth space consistency had to manifest in physicality as well. And then the integration of the energy from our maggrav and the Earth's maggrav comes together as an inertia field interaction, which we call physicality. So we understand then the inertia field is a product of the arrival of all of this energy. And so this matter plasma dimension becomes a total sum of the momentum. And we see this momentum in different energy states because we have multiple layers. One layer is physical. We can touch it and we can see it, but another layer is plasmatic. And although we can't touch it or see it, it's still part of us. And so we have to understand that this matter is a manifestation and it's a representation of the inertia field, whether that inertia field is a feeding field or is a feedback field. And either way that we look at it, we are seeing it only as a feedback field because we only believe our experiences. But there is a gravitational confirmation. As we said, let there be light. And where did that come from? And we've seen this hydrogen. Well, we can't see the hydrogen. It's a clear gas. But it gives us an emission spectrum. It's its own fingerprint. And so that becomes a gravitational inertia field. Well, you know, oxygen is the same way. It has a gravitational inertia field, and it has a unique fingerprint, and it is a gravitational confirmation. So as these things are coming together, we start to realize that there are multiple dimensions, and when they come together, each is an inertia field. So each one is a product of two. So 1 plus 1, not the same one, plus another one, a different one, and plus another one, still different. And they come together and they create more than 3. But that 3 is only 1 because it's a product of the other 3. But it's more than 3 because we still have the other products. So the inertia field maintains its momentum by being fed by these other inertia fields. So we have the belief feeding dimensions and the experience feedback dimensions. So as an observer, how do we function? Well, we only depend on our feedback. This has to change because without change, we can't justify our momentum. You see, because the inertia feeding feeds 1, where 1 plus 1 equals 1. But which one? It doesn't specify. So it's entirely possible that one has more momentum than the other one. And if my team is gaining momentum and winning, and the other team is losing momentum and losing the game, what's the other momentum doing? Oh, those are the fans. And some fans are cheering and some fans are crying. And so all together, we all fit in that arena. And so we have a really good old time. Aren't we having fun? And so here we are with our own gravitational confirmation. And let there be humanity. Well, that's pretty good, isn't it? And so what? So what we find is that there's a nuclear feeding inertia. And it's a coming together of these fields, and it's a rotating field. And each field that comes together is coming together from the matter state, antimatter state, and the dark matter state. And each of those has fragments. So each one is a fragment of the complexity, but each one is a byproduct of the different energy fields. And it isn't just straightforward like that, because there's a lot of variety. We have 8 billion people on this planet, and they're all unique. But, how many insects do we have? How many animals do we have? How many plants do we have? How many fish? So the numbers are really incredible, hard to imagine from our little tiny perfect world. So where did all that momentum come from? And how do we maintain it in our little tiny perfect world? So this gradient momentum is a rotating field going from the higher to the lower. And think of it as a cartwheel or a ball and string. So a cartwheel is a gymnastic movement, right? Where you rotate your body sideways in a horizontal plane. So whether you put one hand and then the other touching the ground as you move. But you can't go very far with one cartwheel in your cart. Even 2, well, I guess 2 could be like a sulky. But 4 would be preferred, because that would be like a buggy. And then, of course, that's what we are. We're the 4-wheelers. We have a circular momentum. So we like to do our cartwheels, or maybe think like tumbleweeds, or maybe plasma fields when you see our world coming together with a circular momentum. So it's a combination of the linear and the circular, but it's moving. So when the Earth rotates around its axis, today is not the same as it was yesterday. And tomorrow will not be the same again, because the Earth is moving on its orbit around the sun. And this year will not be the same as last year, nor will it be the same as next year, because the Earth and the sun are rotating. So with this movement now, it's no longer circular. It has a spiral momentum. It's like a cartwheel, but with a twist. So what makes a tumbleweed a tumbleweed? Well, because it keeps blowing across the pasture. It keeps on moving. And that is the same with the plasma field. Maybe on a soccer field, you see how come the soccer balls are moving? They're round. And they stay round, but they move. And they don't have an orbital like our Earth. But if you track the orbital with a spiral movement, you get a helical coil. And that is the structure of our DNA and our RNA. And then we have a perpendicular relationship between the RNA and the DNA. And you say, well, wait a second. These are inertia products. And so when we look at momentum, we relate it to acceleration. And this is where the problem comes in, because that is a relationship of force and mass. And we talked that before, because it allows to make calculations. We calculate vectors, collisions, angular momentum. We calculate torque, long-range forces, and of course, the moment of inertia. So the moment of inertia is the acceleration and the movement and the angular momentum combined. So think of the angular momentum as a falling. And if it's falling into increased density. Because we all know that when a satellite orbits around the Earth, each subsequent orbit has a one step closer to the surface of the Earth. And each step closer to the surface of the Earth, we know that the density of the air increases. So if we look at the angular momentum as a falling through increased density, and we know that as we increase the density, then we also increase the pressure. We know that the higher we go up the mountain, the less air pressure we have. The deeper we go in the water, the greater the pressure we have. So as we increase the density and as we increase the pressure, well, of course, we increase the gravity. So we have to think of angular momentum as a falling into increased gravity. And so when we looked at our chakras and we see how they went around, well, they had a movement. So you in your physicality, you can move and your aura comes with you. But in order for your aura to maintain that angular momentum, then we have to go through the whole gamut of emotions, because that's what our aura represents. Everything from peace and serenity to anger and warmongering and all points in between. And so these are all parts of angular momentum, because our emotions rise up and we become excited. Our emotions drop down and we become depressed. And then once we become depressed, then maybe we build ourselves up and we become excited. But, where do you go from there? Well, after excitement, then you get depressed again. And that's the circle of life. And depending on where you are in that life, it's your angular momentum is represented, and so you govern yourself accordingly. But there's a balance. There's a conservation of angular momentum. So if you're unhappy, someone else is happy. And you say, well, they're happy because it's at my expense. Well, my unhappiness is at their expense. Think about that. I have taken away their unhappiness. And now I'm burdened with their unhappiness, and I claim it to be mine. And they say, well, thank you very much. I claim your happiness, and I claim it to be mine. And so we have a conservation of the angular momentum. Isn't that wonderful? So density has a momentum, and it's part of the inertia density, the inertia being a product. And so when we talk about the density momentum, it involves a falling. The rotation is a falling. And as we gain density momentum, it appears that we are accelerating. And so we could say that we're falling faster. But in terms of a rotating field, we keep going because we keep rotating to the other side. We create a circular field, a circular plasmatic field, and then we become an independent. We pull away. So this density momentum has to be maintained. And the inertia density then is added to or diminished from. Well, if we're adding to or diminishing from, how can we maintain a conservation of momentum? Because that is part of the exclusion process where you just pop the cork out of life and away you go, and you work within your containment. In order to maintain your containment, in order for you to maintain your conservation of momentum, you have to be able to maintain the adding to and the diminishing from of energy. So that density then has a gradient charge, and it becomes an inertia accommodation. So when you have inertia at that 0 point, there's no change in angular momentum. So you could say that at that point, you have a conservation of momentum. And you could relate that as a catalytic conservation. Isn't that what a catalytic converter does? It allows it to exchange energy without being consumed. Well, isn't that what the sun is doing? The sun comes up every day and gives us the beautiful rays of sunshine. And it does this every single day. And it doesn't get consumed. It doesn't require fuel. And the reason we have a catalytic converter in our four-wheelers is because we are not burning up the fuel efficiently. So we have to burn it off. In other words, we're wasting our density gradient in that process, and we're calling it catalytic conversion. And we write it off as a catalytic conservation. Nice. So when we look at the density, so up in the sky, we see that gravity seeks density. But then, because the magnetical is feeding, it too is seeking density. Well, how can that be? Isn't that a contradiction? How can one seek density and the other seek density? So in order to maintain the momentum, the circular momentum, there has to be a balance between the magnetical and gravitational field. And there's a pushing and a pulling. And isn't this what happens with our chakra levels? As we are trying to navigate through our physicality and running the gamut of motions, and we're changeable from minute to minute. And as we learn, maybe we'll learn how to do things, or maybe we'll learn how not to do things, or maybe we learn what we need to find out, or maybe we learn what we've been forbidden from finding out. And how does that affect your cornflakes? How do you like me now? And what is the chakra level that you're at that point? So the attraction is a taking, and it's balanced by the giving. So you're pulling and you're enabling, and you become positive and you become gravitational. That's what's important. And so the chakra levels that you have are balanced by the chakra levels of all of humanity, but not just, because there's an impact with the rest of the earth space. because the entire earth space of which we are part of also has chakra levels, and they affect us. And there's a connection. So whether we see it or not, whether we see the tether that is holding the ball and the rope together to facilitate this angular momentum, we find that we have to take other things into account. And so the repulsion becomes the giving. It's balanced by the taking. And it's a pushing out. And once it's pushing out, it's trying to accommodate. And it becomes a negative charge. It's magnetical. And so we have this momentum, and it's a battle. It's a battle between our attention and our contention. And it's reflected in what we retain and what is our intention. And to balance off the magnetical gravitational fields, we become dominant in terms of whether we're feeding or feedback. And becomes a preoccupation because we're hooked on the inertia and the unity. And it's all based on path link and susceptibility, where our emotion of attention and the emission of our retention interacts to create an emission of intention. And that's what we're giving. But it also creates a balance of contention, which is a contention of equality. So I give you what I want. And I also give you what you need. And what I want is to fulfill your need. And the only way that I can do that is if I don't need it. So we all have to make a decision on what do we really need and what do we really want, and how do we balance off this contention of equality, because we can't just be equal within our own realm. There are different planes by axis. There's the polar plane, the equatorial plane, and there's a rotating plane. And each one has its own momentum. And they all work together and they affect our chakras. We have to understand that, because it isn't just a physical thing, it's an emotional thing as well. So if the emotion has an emotional momentum and we understand the physical momentum because we can measure it, then we have to understand that the chakras are a representation in terms of our overall momentum. And so our physicality becomes a representation of that as an inertia field. And the colors mean something in terms of emotion and the translation of it. So are we leaking, or are we absorbing? Are we increasing our energy field? Are we decreasing it? Are we stealing it? All these factors come into play. And how balanced are we? And can you always be at the highest energy state? Well, if you're riding this roller coaster of emotion, pick your plane. Pick your x-axis or your y-axis or your z-axis. And just, choose your circular path. Or absorb the entire spectrum understand that you are not only the giver, but you are the taker, and you are the difference maker. And what we see in our physicality is only a small part. So it isn't just what we see, it's what we feel as well. And when we talk about feelings, we are talking about the emotions. So these emotions are beyond the range of vision. And the scope is from the high frequency to the low frequency. So think of that as an angular momentum of falling into higher density. So if that is a higher falling into a lower and becoming more dense, it also means becoming more gravitational. And so the reason is because there is a calling, a wanting. By having the magnetical deficiency in terms of energy absorption, the gravitational can feed the magnetical. And then that magnetical can be elevated. And we all need help. And we all need to understand that if you want help, you have to enlist the services of a higher power. So the matter state inertia is coming together, not only of the feedback from our physicality, but also from the soul of physicality, and also from the soul. And so each one is gaining a kind of momentum, but we sometimes short circuit that feedback and we become hooked into that lower energy state. So how do we maintain that momentum? So we have to understand that even though we are ignoring the feeding that is coming from the universe, that is coming from our soul, fortunately, that feeding continues. That momentum continues. Unconditional. It's only our interpretation that is imparting these conditions, and it's limiting our horizons. So we are never satisfied, and we're always hungry. And it's very important to be hooked on life, because we were created for a purpose. So the killing of another violates universal law. And the killing of yourself by suicide is even worse. It violates universal law, but it carries a lot more momentum. And it's not good. So the earth space matter state inertia is a combination of all the different fragments of the complexity, and each one on its own has that same capacity and probability to contribute to the whole. Without criticism, without any comment on whether it's big or it's small, because all the fragments are equal, all equal in their contribution. All of humanity is equal as part of the humanity civilization. And so this is where we run into a problem, because some think they're more equal than others. And so they like the product where 1 + 1 + 1 is more than 3. And so all for one and all for me. So they like that inertia to field strength ratio. And it's always just taking, and you maintain that momentum. But from our observer's point of view, there are field strength ratios we have to take into account. The matter state plasma and the matter state inertia. And balance it off with the matter state physicality and the matter state gravitational stability. Each one is an inertia field, and each one is part of the conservation of energy. But it's not in isolation. It's part of the universe. So 1 + 1 + 1, it's more than 4. How much more? Well, you know, it all depends. It all depends on the observer's field strength susceptibility, you know. Are you the gravitational neutron, or, you know, are you believing your experiences? Shortchanging yourself, in other words, which leads to mechanical failures, right? Because in order to avoid those things, we have to have quality control, where all the components contribute to the whole. So it's important for us to have good designs, have good recipes. Purity is important. Any failure here leads to an overall mechanical failure. But it's a two-way street. So each one of us is a maggrav plus the magnetical emission, which is part of the out density. And each one of us is also a maggrav plus the gravitational absorption of the intensity. And so that's a balance. And we maintain our momentum within those two boundaries. And yet we can also go beyond those boundaries. We're not contained within them, but we are contained in this earth-space transmutation state. And we have to understand that the momentum that we have in this transmutation state is being fed. So it isn't just dependent on that angular momentum and how we calculate it, because it's moving. It's not stationary. It is rotating. Every single PM tick is coming by a different path at a different time. And no two are the same. And each one is contributing. So the outer space transmutation state involves all three of these dimensions coming together, and each one has its own momentum. And that momentum is fed by the feeding of the universe and the feedback of our earth state. And we are an integral part of that. And that becomes a new revelation because the things are the way they are for a reason. And just because we don't understand that reason, we know that things are the way they are. And when those things are broken, then they need to be fixed. So somehow, some way, there is this black hole transmutation where we see there's an energy field on one side and is balanced off by the energy field on the other side. And depending on the pH and of that field, it creates an interdependency. And it's balanced as a conservation of energy. But that's just in the physicality. But what if we have a balance between the physicality and the plasma state? And then what happens if we have on the plasma state a balance on one side that's magnetical and the balance on the other side that's gravitational, and all points in between? So when we look at the inertia of the mind, we have to see that it's a product of the soul of the man as an inertia field and the soul of the earth as an inertia field. And those two coming together create the physicality of man. But the physicality of man becomes an inertia field, and the physicality of the earth becomes an inertia field. So either the soul of physicality is missing or the soul of the man is missing. But it's not missing because we have the physicality. So what is missing? The missing is us. We don't know how to read the map. There's a roadmap to the plasma highway where we have the feeding from the universe of 80%, and the feedback is giving us the other 20%. And generally, there's nothing wrong with that because life is for living. Life is for learning. As you go through life, you gain momentum. And so that is fulfilling the other 20%. But if you go through life and you don't see the difference, you want to maintain that exclusion principle and say, well, I'm going to take care of my business and, good luck with that. And so we find that the plasma fader is where we become disconnected. And the soul is impurity based. Feeding back to the soul. So the soul continues to feed. It is unconditional. The soul of physicality is running as an intermediary and is playing with our emotion. And so the universe is created with a true emotion, a purity of the soul. It exists from energy, and that energy is a charge because it's a charge in motion. So that charge tells you which direction it's going because that energy is always in motion. And if it's in motion, then it has to go from somewhere to somewhere else. So all things are working in combination. So whether it's the creation of matter with three things coming together, like the matter state, antimatter, and dark matter, or with two magravs coming together, and then whatever you have is a product of the inertia. But that inertia needs to be maintained. It needs to keep its momentum. And the only way it can do that is by giving and taking from other fields. And so that becomes our soul food. We need to tune in. Each of us has their own channel, and we need to turn on to those forces and drop out of our resistance. All we have to do is provide the pattern, and we get the energy. But which pattern is that? Is it the pattern you make with your finger painting? Or is that the pattern that you make with your emission of intention? And when we find out that our intention is not the intention that we were taught, and we find that we was robbed, been done wrong, one can get seriously angry because there's a truth to power gradient. And it too is inversely proportional. So we find that something is true or tends to be true for the sake of your beliefs. So you play the game how you want. Many like the game of deception, where their game is between hypocrisy and inconsistency. So you run an experiment to prove one thing. And everything is fine until you come to that conclusion and it's substituted. 10 people run the same experiment, and they all come with different conclusions. How is that? There's no consistency there, is there? So that substitution is the transference of the gravitational dominance. At the point of substitution, that intensity equals 0 and the out intensity equals 0. But the gravitational conformation remains. And that gravitational conformation also dissolves because that substitution point is within the black hole field. So that allows us to go from the atomic state to the monatomic state to the polyatomic state to the field state and then beyond. But it also allows us to go in the other direction. And there we have a barrier, our physicality, our Earth state. And when we can break through what we call that barrier, the Coulomb barrier, and we can also progress one step beyond in that direction. And why not? If we're trying to balance things off, we have to be able to go in two directions. So here we are 1 year later beyond Sanya, where we have this Earth-space consistency, where we can see we can create gold. And one man's garbage is another man's gold. So there's always a balance. So we see the small spheres of matter state where we're trying to achieve a Earth-space consistency. And we're kind of upside down when we look at the graphs of our intentions, of our little adult brains. And we see that our souls are suppressed, but our physicality is enhanced. And so we find that we cling on to things like a burr and carry baggage. We have to liberate ourselves, not just physically, because the physical part is the emotion, is the inertia field, the inertia product. So we're looking at the balance of the fields, MAGRAV fields. Our planet is looking for the balance as well. And it's a blue planet. It's very gravitational. And it is giving. It is a giving planet. So we need to establish the pH of peace on this planet. And we are trying with the Kesh Plasma research teams to bring together the advanced scientists around the world to straighten out our understanding the conservation of energy, the conservation of momentum, understanding the conservation of transmutation. And as we've gone on this series of 3 months from February to April on the transmutation flight training, we've done 2, 1 more to go. Please join us for the next and see the results of the transmutation, where the range transition transcends the inertia field and the transmutation dimensions. And so these laws of conservation govern the covalent, the trivalent, and the tetravalent bonding attributes. So the containment of inertia is manifest through the contention of equality. The soul of man cannot be abandoned nor compromised, and the color of man is based on the integration with the soul of the man. This is the integrity of man. We don't need to rely on anything else. We just need to set up our antennas to get that message feeding and that feedback manifestation, tune our transmission, and we will get the transition that we need, where we understand that we selected one force and is magnetical and is balanced by the force selection of another, which is gravitational. The resulting selections feed the MAGRAV manifestation. So the selection manifestation is predetermined. So by enlarging the schemes of reference, we could change the momentum. And your mission of intention consistently affects a standard folding deviation and allows no room for war. You can make a choice, choose the peace dome of intention. And we see that the transmutation manifests in balance with the peace dome. So by increasing our schemes of reference, we can participate with the augmented reality where there's a flux and a flow towards, to, into, within, through, out of, and from every charge, every form, and all mass, matter, or substance. Intensify and extensify what we are. We are and we need to be connected. We cannot be extricated. That connection supports the flux of continuous change. And that connection is hooked on life, the greater oneness. And appears it's going to be a sudden transcending of the limitations of nuclear science. Well, that sudden has been for 583 weeks in a row with the Knowledge Seekers workshops of the Keshe Foundation. This is the Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science, welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers, learning about the new selection process of the new plasma science. There's a world peace treaty. We need to sign it with a pen, with a soul, and with our true intention. And we ask ourselves, is the momentum of inertia a paradigm starter or stopper? So self-importance is the feedback inertia of adulation. Is the peace dome of outer space an umbrella or a fountain? Is the inertia of the present governed by the dimensions of history? How do we impart the importance of self in a universal context? Or tradition doesn't allow us to do things better. So we have to supplant tradition with the momentum of the new physical transmission dimensions. Plasma science is delivered daily via the Peace Dome in a practical exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new outer space age. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Thank you all for allowing me to present.
Well, thank you, Alex, for sharing your understanding of the plasma technology. Let's see if our participants, and they do go far and wide, from Canada to Brazil, from Austria, Germany, the United States to South Africa. Let's see if any of the participants have a question for you or a clarification on what you've presented.
Yes, I would like to try to clarify my understanding, if Alex wouldn't mind.
Hi, Gail. Go ahead.
Hello, Alex. Thank you for a very interesting thing, which I am kind of attributing it to the movement of a magrav around a star, for example. In the book I read, I think book 2, I was reading that light, when it's like a magrav moving, it does not bend, but it finds positioning, continual positioning. Is that what you were describing with the momentum?
That's right. Yes.
Okay. So it's not bending, it's positioning, infinitely positioning, always.
Well, it may be going in a direction, but it doesn't necessarily go in a straight line. I mean, I'm pretty sure that most of us are not navigating our lives in a straight line. We have to navigate the crooked line to get to our destination sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to say. It's just, if I'm thinking about it correctly, I would have very, very small vector each and every time that it positions itself. So it looks like it's bending.
Well, it has to bend because you cannot go from a straight line to a circular motion. You know, the problem goes back to our mathematics. You know, we talk about, you know, the Pythagorean, you know, formulas, and
Mhm.
that's all good with angular momentum. But what happens when we get into the spiral momentum? And, you know, which direction are you going? You know, are you going from left to right or up or down, or are you just going around in a circle? And can you extricate yourself from the rest of the universe? Can you, you know, just say, well, you know, I'm just going to exclude myself from this picture here, and you know, so I'm going to be a non-participant. Really? How can you be a non-participant? Imagine if all of us were non-participants.
Trying not to look at one another. It's crazy. I think part of it was, I'm just trying to remember, because it's going by a Magrav, okay, light is Magrav, Magrav is a Magrav. So if you are going by a star, if you didn't have a magnetosphere, you would become part of the star and its magnetosphere. So
No,
the idea is the momentum and the direction. If you're being pulled as a Magrav, you're going to continually change your direction to go around that corner or whatever the star is positioning itself as.
that's right. You'll be swayed,
Yes, you'd be swayed.
right? Yeah, and you know, who's your favorite idol, right? And so why is it not you? But what I just want to correct one thing, because we all have our magnetosphere. The magnetosphere is our containment,
Right.
and that is a negative charge. And so anytime that you come in contact with another magrav, then there's a uh, like poles, and like poles repel.
Mhm.
So that causes a course change. But if your constitution is weak, then you in fact become susceptible to the gravitational force. You ignore the magnetical force. And in fact, you wouldn't even see it. So you get pulled in. And so there's two ways to get pulled in. Either you allow it, or that force is very, very strong by many orders of magnitude. However, when we look at the fragments of the complexity, we find that even the smallest carries a very strong negative charge. So it can affect the whole picture.
So it is positioning in a way.
Yeah, it all depends on the constitution. If it's a strong constitution, in other words, containing a vast amount of energy and integrity, so how can it do that? Well, it has to have a higher spin. It has to have a higher density,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
And it has to have a higher field strength in terms of its ability to give, because it is so tiny. So in order for it to give a lot, it has to take a lot. So its momentum becomes radically larger, right? Because something that is huge, it needs a lot of energy to maintain its hugeness. But it's giving a lot of energy, but it's all consumed in the maintenance of its momentum. But something that's very, very tiny has a lot of power.
Yeah, especially if it's a dot that can create the whole universe.
Especially if it's a what? I didn't hear.
I always say the word dot, but
A
a
dot.
point of existence. Yeah.
Well, it's true. And Richard Feynman from NASA said that. He said you could put all the energy of the universe into a thimble. So we find that the thimble is a symbol of the universe. And you say, well, how can you pack all that energy into a thimble? Well, when you put stuff in a package, and let's say you put air in a balloon, so the containment of that balloon is the balloon itself. But if you were to remove that balloon and the gas that's inside, it will no longer be contained to that field. It'll expand. Why? Because that gas is all magnetic and it's going. So it becomes bigger.
Creation. Well, thank you. Thank you, Alex, for beautiful pictures.
Well, I hope it's making sense to you. Claudia had some questions here.
Hello, Alex. Thank you,
Hi.
Gail. Um, thank you so much. It's one of the class I understood a little, but makes sense for me about the momentum. And a question that I had a long time is about the reason that increase the number of human beings and the other beings on Earth in the last, for example, 500 years ago. We have more beings now. And my questions could be, is the motion of the planets, the momentum of the planets about the wanting to give more, is increase the gravitational emotions of the planets that increase the beings, the number of beings here?
That's correct.
But this will, for example, will change in the time and place position. Will be like a limit for this.
Well, yeah, but we're not anywhere near that limit.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to ask the question, why? And why is not a question, why is the answer? So I agree with you, we are attracting more, but the rate that we're attracting is a very slow rate. So how can we change that rate? So what is curtailing our paradigm change? What is preventing us from going through this change? So clearly, there are some who don't understand the rules of the family, the humanity family, and they are undermining and working against it. And so that becomes the question that you have to ask with respect to your family and your environment. So we all need to take care of business at home so that we can be more helpful on a community level. It is from there that we gain the momentum that we can increase our spheres of influence. So if each of us were to do that in our own small way, And because it's a small way, it's not hard to imagine that each of us could double our influence. You know, if you're solo, one more, and you have a partner, and now you've doubled your influence. Well, if all of us were to double our influence, that gradient change, that change in momentum would be far, far stronger than the suppression that is going on right now. And then the question becomes, if humanity is suffering, then those who are enforcing that suffering are also humanity. Oh, what exactly are they trying to achieve? Because if you take from humanity, you're taking from yourself. But that doesn't make any sense. And so by your definition, if we were to achieve the totality, the complete gravitational taking, what happens at that point? Then the gravitational becomes exceedingly large and the magnetical becomes exceedingly small. So on a pH scale, you're not talking about 6 and 8, you're talking about 1 to 14.
Yes.
And now you're at the extreme. Well, guess what happens? Guess what happens? Now the momentum has to flip. So, you know, if you're working hard to be more gravitational, then, you know, there's going to come a time where that road is going to come to a dead end and you're destined for failure. And that's what's confounding, that this whole thing is destined for failure. And so why is that? And it has to do with our knowledge, not understanding that the momentum that we feel is not just on what we take, not just what we achieve in physicality, but what we feed to our emotional strength. Because our physicality is an inertia field byproduct. It is a byproduct. It is not what's created. We can change the byproduct by changing the ingredients, by changing the design, by changing the recipe. So it's the recipe that makes the product. And it's the chef that knows how to use the recipe to make the product. And both the chef and the recipe can change. So who's in control? And you say, oh, well, you know, imagine if you're the dinner and you're complaining, I don't like the way things taste. Yeah, but you're the dinner, you're the product. You are not the chef and you're not the recipe. So, you know, your complaining is falling on deaf ears. That's not where your focus of attention should be. Then either change the chef and give them more capability, or change the recipe by improving it. And so how do you change either one of those? By giving more to feed that, to increase that gravitational strength. So if you increase the gravitational strength of the chef and the gravitational strength of the recipe, well, guess what? You will increase the gravitational strength of the physicality. But that strength is not all muscle bound. That strength is a balance between the physicality and the emotion. And we know that the emotion is a language that both the soul of physicality and the soul of man understand. So don't go telling the souls what to do from a physical standpoint. you have to welcome. You have to be more welcoming, to encourage. So it becomes an attitude adjustment.
This is so beautiful. I remember Mr. Cash saying, like a comparison, if you have a pain in your lumbar part, you have to move your fingers on the foot. So you have to go to the small and not. And you said about the family, go to your family, it's a micro, it's the same macro. And you change. Oh, so beautiful.
But we
Thank
need
you.
help. We need help, and the science needs to give us that help, because we have a inertia. You know what they say inertia is, without the energy or the movement will not change without an external force. But there is always an external force, because you can't maintain the momentum without having an external force. That external force at least creates the field. But by changing it, then we can change the outcome. And we realize that what we've been doing for thousands of years is not working. It's not working. So we don't need to dwell on it. Whatever you give your time and attention to, all the problems, that's not going to change. But what we need to change is the emotion that is overriding. We need to change the momentum. And how do we change the momentum? One player on the team can change the momentum. And it can go two ways. Either that one player does something that is spectacular and everyone's, oh, wow, here we go. Or a player from the other team says, oh, you know what? We are going to impose our will. We are going to crush you. Really, what happens when you make something smaller? You increase its density. Think Jack in the Box. Think popcorn. Yes, we can change the momentum two ways. So it becomes a very tactical way of maneuvering, because the tactics that we've been using so far are not working, because they've been physically feedback dominant. So now we have to enlist the services of our soul and ask it to provide, and be direct. Ask for specific things. But when that specific thing is, understand it has to be in a plasma condition, because that plasma condition has to interact with an environment. So if you're wishing for a product, you're missing the point. You have to wish for the assistance. You have to wish for the purity, and you have to wish on behalf of the environment. So you want peace and serenity in your family, wish for the benefit and welfare of your family first. You will automatically get your wish fulfilled. And that's the difference between when you go home or when you go to the bar to drown your sorrows. I'll have a whiskey, please, because the home life is unbearable. I want to be transferred to a winning team. Well, that winning team's not going to want you because you're already a loser. So think like a winner. And the only way a winner can win is when the team around him wins as well. So it takes two hands to clap. Thanks, Claudia. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much. Mhm.
Any other thoughts, comments, questions, rebuttals, or the like?
Thank you all for allowing me to present. I hope you're enjoying these series. We're getting a chance to talk about some things that um, we don't talk about on a regular basis. And we need to understand that we're not all scientists, we're not all academics. We all have our skill set and we all have our environment, and we all need to do our thing our way. And so we're all trying to impart the tools that will help each of us navigate our own course on the plasma highway. So thank you all so very much, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Okay, thank you again. Alex, is there any other thoughts, comments, questions? I know when I did a little bit of transmutation in the reactor group, I didn't feel any momentum at all. I went to 3 different places, but yet it was instantaneous. And even in the craft, I'm thinking, you know, if they have a shielding around them, if you were in a craft and you took a turn at 20 Gs, would you feel any momentum, or am I missing your point on momentum?
Well, this is the thing. We are looking at momentum as something in the physical context only. And so we're trying to calculate the momentum. And so, yeah, you know, when you change your direction, you know, you talk about G forces and things like that. But, you know, there are craft that are flying around in our skies that can seem to turn at right angles, and they don't slow down and they don't speed up. It's just one moment they're going one way, next moment they're going another way, and they're going at such speed that is incredible. And so, you know,
Right, and the occupants don't get thrown up against the wall or anything, do they?
well, you don't know that. The thing is that they are not suffering. It doesn't seem that they're suffering any damage. So they're operating on different rules, right? And this is the amazement that you know we're having. So we say, okay, well, we can't explain it mathematically, so therefore we better not talk about it. But you know, it's there. We have thousands and thousands of witnesses around the world. You know, so what are you going to say? And so in that process, we're losing credibility. So what are we going to do now? Are we going to change, or are we going to let the tumbleweeds get in our way?
Right, I was thinking when you sleep and you go to different locations, let's say, do you feel any momentum when you change scenery? In other words, maybe you went to see the grandmother and then you went to someplace else and then someplace. Is there any momentum sense in that process? I've never noticed any. Not that others may feel sensations, but I don't think that momentum exists in the transmutation. It's instantaneous.
But again, the momentum is a conservation of energy. So you have to take into account the fact that you're moving. Okay, the discussion on momentum seems to take into account as if you extricate yourself from the universe. The fact that you moved is fundamental, is a fundamental manifestation of momentum.
Did you move or did you connect? This is what I'm thinking about the guy
Oh,
in
it's not either
Linz
or, it's both.
who was on the moon, but we didn't see any momentum there.
You moved.
Yeah, we connected.
Yeah, but you moved. Yeah, you connected. You have to move. You have to move plasmatically.
Okay.
The measurements of momentum, the way we have been taught and understand it, is physical exclusive. We have a momentum in the plasma highway where you can move wherever you want. Now we have the awareness. How is that awareness going to affect your momentum? You gave it no thought before. Now that you have an awareness, now that we're discussing it, now you are giving it thought. The giving of the thought is contributing gravitationally to the momentum. And as we go through the transmutation training process, and it gets more and more intense, right? It becomes more and more dense. It becomes more and more gravitational. It will be easier and easier to go through the transmutation process. That's a fact.
As
That
I said,
momentum will be
thank you.
overwhelming.
Thank you for sharing your understanding.
Yeah, take that.
What are you having for dinner tonight, if I may ask?
Listen, I have been grappling with this problem with moment arms and angular momentum and all that, and I just can't understand it because I'm only looking at it in one dimension or two dimensions. But you know, every dimension there's a falling down, and that falling is comes in conflict with acceleration. This has been something that has been bothering me since, well, since high school, actually. And you say, well, is it that big a deal? Yeah, because nothing has made sense. It was a nice subject to talk about, but it wasn't the glue that bonded everything together. In fact, it became a side road that, you know, oftentimes went into a ditch. The thing is that there has to be a consistency with respect to the plasma science, and there has been. This is the thing. Once you have a theory, and once you disprove that theory, it's over for that theory. Forget about it. But there are aspects of it to learn. So when you're looking at the momentum, it isn't just the angular rotation. It isn't just the angular momentum. We have to understand that through the movement, there has to be an increase in density. Has to be, because you're going from one to the other.
If I knew more, I would say not really, but I don't know more.
Well, Mark, if you're at home, okay, you are contributing to the density of your home. And then you decide to go to the grocery store. You have now diminished the density of the home and you've increased the density of the grocery store. Anytime you move, you are changing the magnetical gravitational field forces within that environment. And that's the part that we're missing. We're missing what is our presence in the presence of the environment. We're just looking at our presence and we're saying, okay, our presence, excluding the environment, we have a conservation of energy. But you can't exclude the environment, because if you exclude the environment, then you just don't exist. Because where would you be? You always have to be somewhere. Where exactly would
You can be in 1,000 different places, as I
Right.
understand it. I can leave the home and leave energy there to maintain that density and still go somewhere else.
That's beautiful, you see? So now you understand how you can be a fragment of the complexity. It's perfect. Well done. A plus.
No, I like mine rare, Alex. Okay, are there any other thoughts, comments, questions? I'd like to play the new tomorrow and then the final disclaimer when we wrap up here for today. Again, another gift from the creator in so many ways. But this came out of this meeting. I think Lisa made a beautiful video. We haven't played it in a while. And again, this is the gift from the creator that it's going to allow all the created beings to transit between the two dimensions. And I think this is a very beautiful video. This is one that Mr. Kesh had delivered, I think in 20 or 21, when he came into one of these meetings for the North American Corona team at the time. We've transmuted our name as well. All the groups have. So if are there any other thoughts, comments, questions, issues, something you'd like to raise, please open your mic. I want to thank you, Alex, and every other participant and attendee that was here today. I'm sure the souls were quite active interacting, even though we didn't hear a lot in the physicality, but I thank those who voiced things. So definitely there's a lot of movement going on the energy level, if we can say that. Maybe not as much as in the physicality or speaking, but that's fine. We call that the silent line of communication. And this is the way the teaching is going across the universe. I think he's talking about creating a system from his voice and projecting it into the universe, which is going to make a big difference. Again, I don't fully understand that, but most of the technology I haven't fully understood. But we know where we can find it, and we know we can find more and more of it in the Keshe Foundation store as the days, weeks, and months move ahead. If no one else would like to share anything, then I'll take the screen. We'll play the video and the final disclaimer. The meeting will come to an end. Any others? Okay, Alex, I think you've fed everyone quite well today. They seem to be all satisfied and, in a way, satiated, although I'm sure their hunger for more continues, as this knowledge will never end. So thank you all for joining us and making this meeting, and thank you, Alex, for delivering your understanding and sharing of the technology.
Pleasure. Thank you.